Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Hey there, out in internet land. This is your friend Charlie Hunter. It's the reasonably fine art talk for some time in endless January in Vermont. I do not have a fire going today in the office room here, and there's one cat who is quite annoyed by that. So if you hear some disgruntled yowling, that is what is going on, I promise you. Anyway, I thought today we would talk about non-figuration since we are realist painters, but we like playing with not being quite so literal now and again. And that's really what is interesting me these days. Now, I'm up here in Vermont, and Betty Sue is down there in Texas, and she is pulling the technological strings. And I thought we'd just get right into it. Let's get right into it, ladies and gentlemen. Betty Sue, could we have the very first slide? So this is something I was doing last winter. I was taking a online watercolor class from the great Andy Evenson, and I recommend it highly for any of you thinking about taking an online watercolor class. Andy Evenson is the best. I don't want to paint like Andy, but I wanted to learn basically how to approach watercolor. And I mostly learned my favorite quote yet about watercolor, which is John Singer Sargent saying that painting in watercolor is basically like trying to paint in the middle of an emergency. But one of the real techniques is wetting the paper and then letting the paint bloom. And it gives that wonderful misty effect. I started playing with the idea, since you all know I work with squeegees a lot, with loading up the squeegee with paint and letting that be the bloom. And that is what we are looking at here. The edge that delineates between what we would assume is a tree line and a snow-covered field and what may be a stone wall or something, dividing one field from another, that is all just the squeegee mark. So the squeegee came down from the top, did a little hiccup, and then was placed down one final time. Then I put a coat of encaustic on top of it once it dried. And I was pretty happy with that. I love how suggestive it is. Suggestive in the good way, not in the, well, always are good ways, but in the platonic way, how it suggests a landscape without me actually painting a landscape. And that has led to a bunch of further experimentation. So let's go to the next slide, Betty Sue. This was trying to take it about as far as I possibly could. This is a tiny piece. It's 4 1/4 by 6 1/2. And that's because the squeegee is a 6-inch squeegee. That is loading up the squeegee with gray acrylic ink. I think it was more watery on the right-hand side. And pulling down from the top, doing the hiccup in that second line. That's about as minimal as it can get. I did a coat of encaustic on top of this as well. And I'm not very happy with what the encaustic did. It made it kind of yellower. But what's done is done. But I thought the mark was fascinating. Again, how we are going to read that as figuration when it is, all it is the mark of a squeegee. And the tone gradations are so reminiscent of a photograph. Where can you go with that? How do you make marks that haven't been made 80 billion times before? I mean, I love much realist art, but I'm not terribly interested in making that. I can look at other people making that and be very, very happy with it. I want to really be on the edge. When I'm over in this realm, I want to really be on the edge of realism and utter, it's not abstraction because it's not it's not trying to get away from figuration. It's just making a mark and seeing how it reads as figuration. So this was also done last January, February. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. This was a larger experiment in exactly the same domain. This is taking gator board, which is a gypsum covered hardboard. It's like foam core, but it's much more rigid. And if you like whack your fingernail against it, it sounds hollow. It's not papery. It feels like a hardboard. The thing that's great about it is you can cut it to size using a T-square and box cutters. This is a 16 by 32, which is a standard size that I use for, it's about the largest that I ever go with plein air. And what I did was, again, taking this is not primed. This is just the pure gypsum surface. And I again took gray acrylic ink, loaded it up a really wide squeegee, a 16-inch squeegee. And I believe I sprayed with water across the mid-band. I touched the squeegee down on the right-hand side, pulled down, lifted up, then did the same thing on the left-hand side. And then did a gesture with a brush, which I really hated afterwards. And I've covered up with the dark mark in the foreground. But look again at that band in the middle area. To me, it is astonishing how we read that as a landscape. You know, it's utterly mysterious to me how our brains do that. And I always say that I think it's because we were trained when we lived in the African veldt to be looking into the shadows and making sure that we weren't seeing a saber-toothed tiger ready to come out and eat us. I tend to think that we see pattern even when pattern isn't there for reasons of survival. And I'm really thrilled with how that mid-band looks. Now, of course, this is just because I have the proverbial non-sexual man crush on Doug Fryer and Doug Fryer's art. And I'm just trying to imitate Doug Fryer without really, really obviously imitating Doug Fryer. This reminds me of Doug Fryer's stuff, but it's so not exactly like Doug Fryer. And I was so happy. I was like, Charles, this is a breakthrough. And soon you will have acolytes the way Doug Fryer has acolytes. And no, this is not found a forever home. No one feels as enthusiastic about this painting as do I. But anyway, so this is the painting as it is now. And if you look at it carefully, you will see that there is kind of a grayish wash over the paint in the foreground. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. So this was when I first put that second pass of paint down. This is acrylic paint because if I used oil paint, since the surface isn't primed, I could have put a clear coat of medium on top of this and then put oil on top of that. So clear acrylic medium, that would have allowed me to have the acrylic underpainting, an acrylic barrier, and then oil on top of it. But I was just really experimenting. I didn't know if I'd be able to make this painting survive or not, because as I said, I really hated the brush stroke that is in the foreground, which you can't see now because I've covered it up with these very non-figurative squeegee and brush marks. But I like very much how undisciplined they are and how organic they feel. They do a very effective job of covering up that brushstroke that I hated. But they, in and of themselves, I thought, were too dark for the misty quality of that far, what we read as the far landscape, the hills and the hills and the trees and the separate fields. So next slide, please, Betty Sue. So this is what I did, is I took a very dilute white acrylic wash and painted over most of the immediate foreground to just knock it back a little bit. And I am happy with how it now reads. How do I apply the paint to the squeegee, asked Jim Ross. Well, I have a big glass palette, and so I'll have a puddle of paint, and then you just put the squeegee down. You put the squeegee down in the middle of the puddle of paint, and that loads the blade of the squeegee. I will be doing an online workshop in August where I'm going to be going into, it's going to be a 1 3-hour workshop, and I'll be going into a lot of the detail of squeegee, of how I do the squeegee work, because I will have, it will be a live demo, so it'll actually be me applying paint as opposed to me sitting here in my office blathering. Claire had a question about do I protect the surface at the end? Yes, this has an acrylic varnish put on it. Could we go back to the not the previous? Yes, that one exactly. Thank you, Betty Sue. So this is how it looks now. So to me, this is now unified sufficiently that it still has the rawness that I crave, but has the unity that I think is necessary to have it read as a nominally figurative painting. And it's currently at Will Basic Fine Art in Northampton, Massachusetts, ladies and gentlemen. Will's got it for another, well, until he gets sick of having it. Now let's go ahead to the next painting, Betty Sue. So this is continuing in that series. This is 4x11. I had some scrap pieces of gator foam, of gator board, I'm sorry. I gessoed this one. You can see that there are gesso marks. And then I believe, again, I wet the top and with the gray ink, just pulled down and let it bloom. And it reads to me like an old glass plate negative, or not negative, but an old glass plate photograph. I was very happy with this. This again is just one pass. You know, I probably did 20 of them before getting, it's probably 20, no, it's probably 15 failures to one that I keep. But there's this one, Westmoreland from Westminster, which and the names, of course, are coming up with names for paintings. That in our little world, there's a real tendency for people to do punny titles, which I don't really love. What I tend to do is use a lot of lines from song lyrics, or if something reminds me of something in my life, I'll use that. And if you drive along Interstate 91 from Brattleboro, Vermont up to Bellows Falls, you are in Westminster, Vermont. You're looking across the Connecticut River Valley to the hills on the New Hampshire side. And Westmoreland is the town that you are looking at, or the township that you are looking at from Westminster, Vermont. One interesting thing about Westmoreland is that if you think about it, you can't pronounce it correctly. Because if you look at it too long, you go Westmoreland, or you go Westmoreland, but it's Westmoreland. Unless I've thought about it too much and I'm now pronouncing it wrong. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. East of the Cove, same thing. Now, again, this I remember for sure. The squeegee mark, the loaded squeegee is pulling all the way down from the top of this surface. I believe I trimmed it after I was done, so that the initial touch of the squeegee actually occurred slightly above where it is now, where the trim is now. So pulling down, this is the gray Amsterdam gray acrylic ink with some, I think with some warm gray and the merest drop of burnt sienna. And acrylic ink is just very, very, very dilute acrylic paint. It's useful for airbrushes and pens and stuff like that. But I love the warmth that this particular mixture gave. And again, if we were painting with brushes, there's no way you can get those transitions from the dark darks so effortlessly into those midtones that look like, you know, photographs from 1910. To me, it's fascinating, fascinating. And east of the Cove, there is a place in Bellows Falls called Herrick's Cove that is a wildlife sanctuary. And when you go driving along Route 12, you look over at Herrick's Cove, and this does not look unlike what you see from looking across the Connecticut River. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. And this one is also at Will Basics, 6 inches by 18 inches, acrylic on board. This one is on, actually, I believe, a cradled wooden board with a very, very smooth finish that my friends at Royal Talons North America would not approve of, because it is acrylic enamel, acrylic semi-gloss enamel from the hardware store. And it's not guaranteed to be archival enough for our friends at Royal Talons North America. My feeling is it's pretty darn archival, and I'll probably be dead before anything goes wrong with it. And in that case, let the person who buys it demand a refund. I won't be around. Of course, no one has bought this yet, which is too bad. But this one, again, I love because the mark, I put it down. There was, if you look to the middle left, where it gets dark, that what I read as a road receding in the distance, that just appeared. That was not a calculation on my part. I didn't construct the way I loaded the squeegee with that. The vertical that occurs immediately to the left of what looks like the road receding in the distance, I don't know. I think that was a brush stroke. And then when you go to the right, I did add those 2 additional things that suggest utility poles. So there is the suggestion of 3 utility poles going to the right. I love how unforced the sky is. And again, that's just drawing down with less force than a great deal of force, and then pulling back, and that's where and then pushing down, and that's where the dark darks occur. So Jim asked, as I said, Jim asked how I apply the paint to the squeegee. I have a large glass palette. So this is 6 by 18. So this is an 18-inch squeegee. Yes, Ettore does make squeegees up to like 36 inches wide. I haven't gotten my mitts on a 36-inch wide squeegee yet, but I plan to at some point. So I have a big glass palette that's probably 2 feet across. I squeeze out the ink, which is the consistency of milk. And then I spray with my spray bottle, kind of a pass of water. So the ink is kind of blooming into the water. And then I put the squeegee down in that, and that loads the squeegee. It's just kissing the squeegee to that surface and then lifting it up, and it's loaded with ink. Again, I do think I wet the surface of this before I did the pull down. I've got to do more of this experimentation. It's just, I was so thrilled with this series. The question is, where am I going to go with it? And I wanted to go to the next slide to show where one direction that I started going. Oh, this is the close-up of what I was talking about, with what looks like a road receding in the distance, and that the vertical to its left that so suggests a utility pole. But it's just what ink did on a surface. I had nothing to do with it. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. Okay, this is trying to take those lessons from the acrylic ink to water mixable oils, because I'm trying to figure out where I can go with this system, with this idea. And because I work with water mixable oils in my paint that I apply with brushes, it's logical for me to try using water mixable oils with this same technique. Now, this is on one of my typical plein air surfaces, which is the gator board with muslin, and then 3 coats of acrylic gesso. And that allows for, that's archival enough to keep our friends at Royal Talents North America from not yelling at us. It's very good for plein air painting with brushes. It seems moderately successful to me for this technique, though I don't feel like I've done anything that's really great yet. This to me is interesting, but it's not great. I do like the bloom over there on the left. That is Van Dyke Brown, which tends to precipitate out into an orange when you let it sit in a puddle of water. The darker parts go down, and the orangey dye kind of floats to the top. So this would be Van Dyke Brown, ultramarine, and probably raw umber. How do I wet the surface spray? Yeah, I use a plant sprayer, hardware store plant sprayer on a very, very misty setting. What happens if I use watercolor paint instead of acrylic with the squeegee? That was at the beginning, Joe. The very first 2 slides were using, or the very first slide was using watercolor. Anyway, so this was at present is kind of a dead end of where I was going with using water mixable oils with the technique. Not thrilled with it, but I just, in talking right now, have had the idea of maybe I will do a very smooth surface, which I just have made, and try the water mixable oil squeegee technique on that, and I'll let you know how that goes. Is my board laying flat when I do this? Yes, the board is absolutely laying flat. If it was at an angle, there'd be much more drips, and this isn't really one of the places where I wanted to get into drippiness per se. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. So then this is one that I have at my studio now. It's all framed and it's on the wall of the studio. It's a 9x12. This is the same technique with a little bit more brushy manipulation. But you probably at this point, you can recognize the squeegee pulled down. But I think I had brushed on with the chip brush. It would be Van Dyke Brown, raw umber, ultramarine blue in a very, very watery mix. That's over on the upper right. And then, boy, I don't even really remember how I did it. I pulled down with the squeegee, I can see that. And then but it looks like I also brushed on some Van Dyke Brown ultramarine over there on the left passage. Then pulling down with the squeegee, and it makes that in the center part where the paint didn't pull across. there's this wonderful passageway that the eye goes back through. It's barely a landscape, but it still feels landscapey enough to me. I called it Borealis because it reminds me a little bit of like north of Winnipeg before you get to La Paz, La Paz. So that's the Winnipeg, Manitoba. And we were on our way up to Churchill, Manitoba to see the polar bears. We also saw the Aurora Borealis. So that's, I just, it's boreal forest. So I just used that name. But anyway, I posted this on Instagram or Facebook the other day, and people were, isn't that upside down? So I was like, let's try it upside down. Next slide, Betty Sue. That's what it looks like upside down. Now, maybe some people like it better upside down. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't read as anything. And that's funny to me that for something that is so non-figurative, I look at this and I go, yeah, that doesn't make sense. But other people claim that they like it better like this. My feeling is if you like it better like this, if you buy it, you just change how you hang it on the wall. It's okay with me. Yeah, exactly, Dick. It's a two-sided belt. You can show it this way or that way. I don't think you could do it at 90. I think it would look like hell at 90 degrees, but people are different. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. So this is the detail of that passage. And to me, I just love looking at this. This is, I also have proverbial non-sexual male crush on Anselm Kiefer, and certainly this palette and the texture reminds me of Kiefer, and my I Am Unworthy tribute to Anselm Kiefer. But boy, I love how gestural this looks, and I should really be working on how do I scale these marks up to do a 4 foot by 4 foot that has this kind of visceral action to it. See, this is very helpful for me, ladies and gentlemen, to be doing kind of a self-crit on these pieces. It's helping to recharge my batteries. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. So this was taken from the train. Betty Sue and I were on our way from Texas back to Vermont. We were on the Lakeshore Limited in our wonderful little sleeping car compartment, and you go through it about 10 at night. You go through Gary, Indiana, and the steel mills. And to me, I want to paint this, but I don't want to do a literal rendering. But I want it to have the feel of the raw beauty of, there's a wonderful line in the John Hyatt song called "Through Your Hands," and it says the scientific darkness, and this feels like scientific darkness to me. Actually, I think I did a painting called "The Scientific Darkness" that my friend Judy Anthrop has given a forever home, but. We took this picture, and this has gotten me interested again in that process that I was doing last year of the pulling with the squeegee for doing the skies and that the horizon line with the complication of all those forms that are still indistinct, even though they are definitely present. How am I going to do that? How am I going to do that? I think I am going to revisit this process that I've just been talking about. But before, can you make my head big again, Betty Sue? I think before I go today, I want to talk a little bit about the fear of failure, because when you get to a point where you're actually making a decent living doing this art thing, you want to keep making a decent living doing it. And these paintings that I'm showing you are not what is really caught on. If I painted barns all day, I could be making a very, very good living. But I do not want to paint barns all day. And they would be getting worse and worse and worse as I did more and more and more of them. I want to paint barns when I want to paint barns because I want them to be good paintings of barns. So what I need to be doing artistically is very often at odds with what I need to be doing economically. Economically, the current market for my work is that architectural stuff in kind of an Andrew Wyeth palette, put it that way. But I don't want to just, I would rather be less commercially successful and more artistically explorative than make a lot of money doing stuff that was driving me nuts. On the other hand, someone posted, I forget who it was, Kyle Buckland, posted on Facebook the other day that for us artists, the hazard of things like Facebook and Instagram is you start really paying attention to the likes, what's getting the most likes. And we humans want approval. We want to know that what we're doing is striking a chord with people. And this more abstract stuff is not, as I say, is not what has been selling for me. And so I'm hesitant to dive into it because I want to be one of the cool kids. I don't want to be one of the complete outcasts. And I'm talking about this not because I'm terribly worried about this. It's just, it is the internal dialogue that I have going on. And I would assume it's the internal dialogue that a lot of us have going on. And I think it's probably most helpful for me in the context of doing these weekly talks to actually talk about it. Because I think if we don't talk about it, it feels somehow illegitimate, or we think we're the only person going through it. So what I want to say is, you out there, if there is a means of painting, a way of painting that you're really interested in, but isn't yet really bringing you any income, keep at doing what is feeling most interesting. I promise to do that if you promise to do that. Even if you don't promise to do that, I promise to do that. All right, that's enough blueberating this week. Next week, we're going to have Mitch Albawa. I don't really know how to pronounce his last name. I don't know what I did with his book, but I got it around here. He's written a wonderful, 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 wonderful new oil painting book called something like the Oil Painter's Handbook. Nope, that's not it either. Anyway, Mitch Albawa will be our guest next week, and we will know how to pronounce his name by then. Until then, you take good care, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.